Woo boy, I did not get much sleep last night. The smoke detector kept beeping even after we replaced the batteries and pushed the reset button. So since I'll probably soon perish from carbon monoxide poisoning, you guys can join me at the graveyard for these allegedly true and creepy graveyard stories. After all, I put the poop in spoopy. If you have a story of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org for this gorgeous Halloween season. Now, let's begin. I grew up on a cemetery in the Alaskan Tundra. From RosemaryGoez. This is one of many accounts of what has gone down on the land my family owns. I'm a girl in my late 20s. My parents, a charming lesbian couple, own a funeral home and cemetery in the village on the outskirts of the Alaskan Tundra. It was a small business that had been passed down from my mother Agatha's father, who inherited from his father, and so on. Katie, my other mom, was terrified of the whole situation from the beginning. She was positive that someone would get possessed with us living so close to a field of corpses. That's how she put it. Over time, exactly 8 years after they moved, she grew to respect the land as well as the tenants resting in peace there. I was born shortly after her change of heart, but she still limited my access to the cemetery. And while no one was ever possessed, we still had our fair share of creepy experiences at the home and throughout the property. I went to a tiny schoolhouse every weekday from the time I could walk. There were only 30 or so children living in our town, so we were all educated in one room by a small group of teachers. Katie and her twin sister Gloria were 2 of these teachers. The 3 of us would walk to and from town every day, while Agatha and her brother Cal took care of the property. It was a 20-minute trek, but on the occasional day without freezes, we got to take our bikes, and that was generally the highlight of my life. However, on this particular day in December, we had to walk. We were only at the school until about 4 o'clock that afternoon, but the sun usually set around 3:30, so we were shrouded mostly in darkness by the time we got to the dirt road leading up to the property. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and I still used my clumsiness as an excuse not to walk up the path, muddied by snow. Gloria had drawn the short straw and was giving me a piggyback ride up the hill. I was resting my head on her back and staring at the cemetery that was beginning to come into view around the paper birches and spruce trees. It was a sprawling field filled with an odd assortment of mausoleums, colorful tombs, and Inuit and the Russian Orthodox citizens. I was always entranced by the graves and tried to pick out ones that I'd yet to see. We were nearly to the house when I spotted a figure standing in the far right corner of the cemetery. It was hard to discern their age or gender, but I could tell from the build that it wasn't Agatha or Cal. Visiting hours ended at sundown regardless of the date, so I immediately pointed the person out to Katie. Now, most of the finer details are recalled by my parents and older family members, due to my young age throughout most of these events, but I can still clearly remember hearing Katie mutter a curse of some sort under her breath. She helped me off of Gloria's back and ordered that I go inside to tell Cal to meet them in the field. Without hesitation, I suddenly found myself as sure-footed as a bunny on the icy ground and sprinted the last 20 or so yards up to the house. I swung the door open and went into the kitchen where I knew I'd find Agatha and Cal. I quickly told my uncle about this trespasser. Groaning, Cal finished his cup of coffee, which was probably spiked with whiskey, and stood from the table. Ungok Cal was a big guy, maybe about 6'8", with broad shoulders and what I called Fred Flintstone's fists. Basically, he could knock someone out without much effort, and he did so time and time again. He was insanely protective of his sisters and all of the other women in his life, Gloria and Katie included. The entire town respected him and feared him at the same time. He was a nice at-home security system. Naturally, I was thrilled with this tiny bit of excitement in my normally humdrum life. When my uncle charged out the back without so much as a coat on, I turned my pleading eyes to Agatha, who barely flinched at the activity. She stared back at me for only a moment before sighing and motioning to the rack by the door. I grabbed her parka and helped her put it on as we made our way outside. Knowing that her wife was going to be none too thrilled with my presence in the cemetery, Agatha picked me up when we reached the cast-iron fence that surrounded the property. We could see Cal's giant silhouette approaching the tiny ones of Katie and Gloria. We could still see the stranger, who was a good 100 or so yards from all of us. "Let's hide and watch," I whispered to Agatha, when I saw that Katie hadn't spotted us yet. For a moment, I thought my mother would shake her head and go to the others, but she surprised me by giving me a conspiring smile and ducking behind a mausoleum. "We can get to grandmother's grave if we're quiet," she told me with a glint in her eye. She loved the graveyard and had spent her childhood playing in it while also learning about her ancestors and the people of her town. She wanted me to enjoy it as much as she did. We hurried from grave to grave, pausing only long enough to make sure that the others didn't see us. Katie, Gloria, and Cal were moving swiftly as well, but they were too busy eyeing the figure standing only about 20 feet from the large tomb that encased my great-grandmother, which was our destination. When we made it to the tomb, Agatha set me down, and we crouched around the rocks and wood that surrounded grandmother's altar. It was then that I began to feel nerves eat away at my gut. This was a stranger. I could tell. They were standing at the base of the mausoleum that was built to honor the infants who had passed before being blessed by the tribe shaman. This was an old, outdated site that didn't fully honor Inuit customs, and it had been redone in the 1970s, closer to the northern section of the property. No one came to this site because it would be considered disrespectful to the deceased, but it would have been just as disrespectful to tear it down, so it was just a derelict memorial that loomed on the tiny hilltop of that section of the cemetery. Tension filled the air as Cal, flanked by Katie and Gloria, approached the stranger. I could hear my uncle speaking to them, likely telling the person about our hours and asking if they'd like a ride back into town. Cal always started off nice, giving people the benefit of the doubt before going into Hulk mode. Agatha, who had initially been giggling at the sight of her brother looming over the trespasser, was beginning to cling tighter to me as time went on. It took us a few minutes to realize that the person hadn't been responding to Cal at all, nor had they even glanced his way. They just continued to stare at the area just above the mausoleum. Katie and Gloria were exchanging uneasy glances, and at one point Cal told them to go back to the house. They refused and stepped closer to his side. When words failed, Cal resorted to the physical approach. He would later recall that he could tell the person, an old man, was frail and that he didn't want to hurt him. But he wasn't listening, and if he was deaf, he'd have to get his attention somehow. My uncle placed a gentle hand on the gentleman's shoulder, and immediately he felt a wave of nausea overcome him. He hunched over, clutching his abdomen, and cried out. Agatha ordered me to stay put before darting out from behind the stones and over to her brother, who waved her and the other girls off. He insisted that they go inside, but they were all frozen in place. The strange man still hadn't moved, so Katie yelled at him to move. She stepped around in front of him and waved a hand in his face. "You need to leave," I heard her command. "You can't be here after dark. It's not safe." "No, it's not." The stranger finally spoke. He lowered his eyes to smile at my mother. "Are you all right, dear?" He spoke so casually to her that she stood there in shock for a good moment. She looked back to Cal, who was on his knees at this point. While she was distracted, the man turned and headed towards the exit. When he was coming towards my hiding spot, I had every intention of getting up and running away from him, but I was frozen to the spot as well. I felt as if my body was being held down by weights, and I was sinking into the earth. I whimpered and buried my face in my arms, praying to God and my great-grandmother for safety. The ice and leaves crunched in my ears, and I knew Agatha realized my predicament and said something to the others, because I could hear Katie shouting at her. Finally, summoning up some courage, I looked up to see the man walking right past me. He didn't so much as look my way, but as he passed, he said to me, "Good night, Blue Eyes," in a dulcet whisper. Immediately, I relaxed and climbed to my feet. I watched him practically float out of the cemetery and towards the road. Katie ran and got me, telling me that we had to take my uncle to the hospital. As it turns out, Cal had to have surgery because his appendix ruptured. He's convinced that old man somehow cursed him on contact. Even Agatha, sweet but superstitious Agatha, had her doubts about his claims. There was nothing malicious in Cal's approach to the man, so why would he have cursed him? This wasn't the last time we saw the stranger. We actually saw him 2 or 3 more times in the following weeks. He was always at the derelict infant mausoleum, staring up at the sky. He never spoke, but he never bothered anyone, and from that point on, he always came while it was light out. I would sometimes sneak out and watch him from grandmother's grave. He was a white man, which struck a chord with me. It was my theory that he was Katie and Gloria's real father, who had abandoned them when they were still very young. Katie quickly disproved the theory, telling me that her father had died in the early 90s, but that meant nothing to me, because to me, it could still be him. The last time I saw him was in early February the following year. It was snowing heavily, and I was helping Agatha and Cal go about and check to see if all the tombs and mausoleums were closed. Sometimes family members of the deceased would perform rituals on their newly departed, placing ceremonial offerings on their bodies, but they wouldn't always restore their tombs to the way they were. We did our best to ensure that none of the graves would be flooded come the next thaw. When we approached grandmother's grave, I heard Agatha sigh airily, but continue on. Immediately, I looked over to the old mausoleum and smiled at the back of the old man. "Good morning," I called out to him. "There's no such thing, Blue Eyes," I heard him respond over the wind. I began to laugh because it sounded like something Gloria would say after a night of drinking. But suddenly I felt a ball of sadness coil up in my stomach. I began to cry, looking up at Agatha with a sorrowful pout. It was the first time I'd ever really felt dread, and it nearly brought me to my knees. Agatha picked me up and took me inside, where I instantly felt better. After that, the man was never seen on the property again. I was a little sad about it, but the adults were glad. They didn't like the pull that he had on us. The Abandoned Cemetery, Part 1, from Dan C. I grew up in a small town named Chenahan, about 1 hour southwest of Chicago, Illinois. I went to school in the next town over, where I met my good friend Matt. He and I were like brothers, inseparable. I even introduced him to his wife when we were in high school. His wife introduced me to my now ex-fiancé, but that's a whole other horror story. When we were 17, Matt and I got the bright idea to prove to our girlfriends that we were brave and fearless. I told them about an old abandoned cemetery in the town where I lived that had been abandoned for some time now. There's a lot of lore about that graveyard, and honestly, most of it may be true. The cemetery sits on a steep hill and has been in the location since before the Civil War era. This area was known as the Dresden Settlement. The Dresden Settlement was home to many farmers, lumberjacks, tradesmen, and canal workers. It was founded in 1836, but was reduced to a few isolated homes in the late 1850s due to the Civil War. It's been said that after the war broke out, many men and young children went missing. The Dresden settlement was eventually purchased by Jacob Hansel, which was eventually passed down to his daughter Cecilia and husband Vernon Dollinger. This 300-acre area is now known today as Dollinger's Farm. Getting back to the story, the four of us made our way to the cemetery with me driving his girlfriend's old '86 Blazer. When we arrived, it was almost 1 a.m. I was the first one to hop out and scope the area out. The moon was very bright, and there wasn't really a need for flashlights. As the rest of us slowly stepped out of the Blazer, the only sound was the quiet whispers from him, his girlfriend, and my girlfriend at the time. I went to the top of the hill so I could get a better look at the place. I could see them making their way up to me, and eventually they did, and we noticed just how big the moon appeared. On the way down, we looked at all of the headstones, reading the names and dates. My buddy chimed in with a text from a friend, saying the cemetery we were standing in was known for some of the bodies going missing, and that all the departed they could find were moved down the road to the next cemetery in Morris, Illinois. We made it back to the Blazer. We began to get in, but my buddy became ghostly pale. He froze and looked terrified. He asked us, "Do you guys see that thing hiding next to the bush?" I ignored it, telling him to stop joking, and then I started the Blazer. As I backed out, something did catch my eye at the bushes. Whatever it was, it stood up. I'm 6 foot tall, and it was easily taller than I was. It was cloaked in black, and I mean the type of black that blocks out anything. It stepped towards the Blazer, and I quickly put the vehicle in gear and hit the gas. The Blazer began to move, then stopped. I thought it had slipped gears, but I looked in the mirror, and the wheels were just spinning. I heard loud smacks against both sides of the Blazer. It sounded like we were surrounded. I looked up from the mirror and saw the dark figure again, which was now in front of us, which should have been impossible at that rate. I let off the gas and put it in reverse, backing up quickly to get away. Then I put the vehicle back in drive, slamming down the gas pedal and getting us out of there. The whole car ride home, no one spoke a word. We didn't even turn on the radio. The following day, Matt and I went back, this time during the day. There wasn't much to find, save for the big black skid marks from the Blazer's tires. Part 2. 3 years after that incident, we actually ended up going back. We had new girlfriends and were in college now. Matt had a new Nissan Max. He would always joke that it went so fast that he had to get a radar detector. It was early October when we went back. We got to the cemetery just after midnight, and same as before, I went to the top of the hill, and the others met me in the middle. We walked around for a bit, when all of a sudden, Matt's radar detector went crazy. Then the alarm in the car went off, with headlights flashing. I said, "Ha ha, very funny, Matt. Now turn it off." He replied, "Dan, dude, you have the keys, I don't." I checked my pocket, and sure enough, he had put his keys there. I hadn't even noticed it. And his keys did not have a key fob, so his alarm was not triggered by accident. Not to mention the car was off, so the radar detector would not have any power. Then all the noise stopped. Then the headlights began to flash regular to bright and back, over and over. He and I hurried to the car, afraid we were about to have a repeat of the last encounter. I had a hunting knife with me, and he had the blunt end of his flashlight. When we got back to the car, the lights stopped flashing. We quickly looked around and told the girls to get in the car, because it would be best if we left. But when we did, we could feel eyes on us. Both Matt and I were too terrified to look back. But the girls did, and soon asked, "Do you guys know those two people watching us? Because they're standing on the road, and they're waving." Matt floored the gas, and we were out of there. We talked that morning, and we both agreed that it was just a coincidence. Surely our minds were just playing tricks on us. Surely it was nothing. In my mind, though, I knew just as well as him. There was something there, and it remembered us. Part 3. 3 or 4 years go by, and Matt is now back with his high school sweetheart. But I'm single. It's Halloween time, and Dollinger's farm is selling pumpkins for Halloween. So we get in my car and head out to the farm, excited to pick some pumpkins. They brought their friend Katie along. They were trying to set us up together. To get to the farm, we had to pass through the cemetery. Neither of us three looked at it, just kept our eyes on the road and sped past. We eventually left the farm with pumpkins in hand. We began to head out when I saw a car at that cemetery and what looked to be a family getting out. I stopped and let them know to be careful around here. The place was haunted. An older gentleman walks up to the car and says, "That's not polite. This is a family plot, and this is where we come to visit our loved ones." I asked if I could step out and talk to him. He agreed, and I stepped out. Quietly, I spoke to him, saying I'm sorry. I didn't know that and wanted to apologize, because I'd been in there without permission. He said it's okay, and we shook hands. I asked him about the things I've seen and experienced. He said not to worry. He says, Jake is harmless and just likes to play jokes on people, and to be grateful that he lets us leave. The gentleman smiled and walked up the hill with his family. It's safe to say I won't step foot into that place again. I don't want to know what this Jake character will or won't do. The Cemetery, from The Blind Fury. I grew up in a small town in the southern part of Ohio. In that small town, we had a cemetery located right next to the city's swimming pool, park, and baseball diamonds. That cemetery was known for strange occurrences, such as rain falling only where a person was visiting a grave or mausoleum, or a thick fog that would seemingly come out of nowhere and disappear after a short period of time. I've never read too much into these tales as I was a teenager at the time, and figured the stories were made up to scare us. I had just moved back to my hometown after 3 years of living with my dad, who was about an hour and a half away, around 90 miles, depending on how fast you drive. It was a few weeks after Halloween when I arrived back home. I made it a point to seek out and reunite with a very good friend of mine since childhood. Her name was C. We met up and did the usual catching up. A lot had happened since our lives had been separated. After a while, it got late, so we decided to go smoke up and decided to drive through the cemetery, out past the ballpark. Our chances of running into anyone at that time of night were slim to none. We soon made it to the cemetery and began to drive through slowly. A heavy fog began to sweep through. We hadn't gone very far before I spotted what looked to be a white car sitting on top of some gravestones, one of which had been knocked down halfway, dirt scattered all around the gravestone where the car had driven over it. C and I couldn't believe what we were looking at. She wanted me to get out and look inside the vehicle to see if someone was inside. Maybe they had been hurt, or worse. I, on the other hand, was not too eager to see the mess that might be on the inside. We argued for a few moments about who was going to get out and check. In the end, I said I'd do it, because I reasoned that we couldn't just leave someone injured in the car without trying to help. I got into her glove compartment and grabbed the flashlight that she said she kept for emergencies. Then I got out of the car, walking slowly towards the other car and shining a light into it, praying to God that I didn't see something that would scar me for life. After a mini pep talk in my head, I stepped forward and I peered into the car. Thankfully, there was no one there. No splotches of red, no bodies. I was incredibly relieved, but at the same time curious as to where the driver may have gone off to. I mean, what had happened here, and why had it happened? I returned to C's car and informed her that it was empty. All the while, the strange fog grew thicker and seemed to envelop the other car. After she took a look into the car for herself, seeing that no one was inside, we took off and called the police to report what we'd seen. The police did inquire as to what we were doing in the cemetery in the middle of the night, so C and I gave them a lame excuse that I can't remember, and I'm sure they didn't buy it, but it was none of their business. They took our phone numbers and addresses, and we had to go to the police station to make a report on what we saw. We found out later that the vehicle had been reported as stolen. The police gathered that the person who drove the car was probably under the influence and had taken off after the accident because they would have already been in trouble for stealing the car and driving it impaired, and whatever other mischief they'd been into. It's safe to say that we stayed out of the cemetery after that. Neither C nor myself were anxious to have any more experiences at the cemetery. We could do our smoking elsewhere. If you don't want to get duded by a spooky, scary skeleton, then you'd better stay out of those graveyards. Then again, avoiding them is pretty much futile. We all end up there one day, unless you're one of those lucky few who end up at the bottom of the ocean. But those are stories for another time, my man of Medan. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own, and you want to share it for a chance to have it narrated, go to darkstories.org. If you want to support the show, check the links below. I've got a link to my Patreon and a link to my merch store, where you can get some creepy good shirts. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode about scary night shift stories. Kamahi Jordan King says, "This is why I only work days. The nights are creepy and belong to the dead." I wish we had some sort of real statistic that showed how many people have died during the day versus at night. I'm hoping when we do die, we get some answers about things. Surreal Harvest says, "This video really butters my vegan sandwich." Doesn't butter go against the whole vegan thing? It actually confuses me. And now that all these fast food chains are adopting Impossible Meat, it's going to get even more confusing. The day approaches when I accidentally order a vegan burger, and who knows, maybe it'll be a good day. Momo says, "Ah yes, just what I needed to put me to sleep. I wish someone would put me to sleep. Maybe for a few centuries. That'd be nice." The Forlorn Bat says, "To be honest, I'd want to work the night shift, if for no other reason than to experience the creepiness that comes with it. Catch me trying to get a job at a funeral home or something. My sister got a job at a bar, and she says that there's been times where the lights would flicker, but the switch has never moved up or down." That's creepy, but all I can think of is the hash-slinging slasher, or Nosferatu. But I totally agree. I would love to have a night shift job sometime, just to see how many scary stories of my own I can collect. And Mozzarella Cheese says, "You can't quit if you don't have a job." Well, mozzarella, that's a different kind of quitting altogether, my friend. That brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, because more scary stories are coming soon. So stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits from my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're super amazingly attractive people. I can't understand how they're that attractive. Anyway, stay safe out there, and stay creepy. Because this world is a strange one.